Trouble brews after the French and Indian War. By the mid-1700s, North America had become a battleground for the world's most powerful empires, Britain and France. Both nations claimed vast territories, and both wanted control over the lucrative fur trade, waterways, and frontier lands. This rivalry exploded into a conflict known as the French and Indian War, 1754–1763, part of a much larger global conflict called the 7 Years' War. On one side, the British and their American colonists. On the other, the French, supported by many Native American tribes who feared British expansion into their lands. The war raged across forests, rivers, and forts from the Ohio River Valley to Canada. Colonial militias fought alongside British redcoats, and the colonies supplied food, weapons, and men for the effort. It was brutal, bloody, and expensive. When the war finally ended in 1763, Britain emerged victorious. France surrendered most of its North American territory, including Canada, and all lands east of the Mississippi River. On paper, it was a stunning win for Britain and the colonies. But victory came with a cost. The war had nearly bankrupted the British government. The Crown was left with a massive debt, the modern equivalent of billions of dollars. London officials looked across the Atlantic and saw something obvious. The colonies had benefited from the war, so they should help pay for it. That's when the trouble began. Taxes, acts, and outrage. In 1764, Parliament passed the Sugar Act, placing taxes on molasses and sugar imported into the colonies. Then came the Stamp Act in 1765, a tax on printed materials like newspapers, contracts, even playing cards. These weren't hidden trade duties. For the first time, colonists had to pay taxes directly to Britain. The reaction was swift and furious. Colonists weren't angry just about the money. They were angry about power. They had no representation in Parliament. No vote, no voice, yet they were being taxed. They called it taxation without representation, and it became the slogan of a growing movement. Across the colonies, resistance took shape. Merchants boycotted British goods. Newspapers attacked the taxes. Local groups like the Sons of Liberty staged protests, sometimes violently. Effigies of tax collectors were hanged or burned. British officials were harassed. In some towns, the Stamp Act was completely unenforceable. Faced with this backlash, Britain repealed the Stamp Act in 1766, but they weren't done yet. Later that same year, Parliament passed the Declaratory Act, boldly asserting that it had the right to make laws for the colonies in all cases whatsoever. Then came the Townshend Acts in 1767, new taxes on glass, lead, paint, paper, and tea. The colonial outrage returned, fiercer than ever. To the British government, these were reasonable laws. Britain had protected the colonies. Britain had paid the price of war. Now, the colonies needed to do their part. But to the colonists, it was something more. It felt like a shift from self-governing partners in the empire to subjects being controlled. The long-standing policy of salutary neglect, the old habit of letting the colonies manage themselves, was ending. And the colonists noticed. The stage was now set. A decade of rising tension, miscommunication, and power struggles was just beginning. By the late 1760s, the colonies were no longer simply protesting taxes, they were awakening politically. A new American identity was forming, and with it, a sense of resistance. The colonies had grown tired of being treated like misbehaving children. To them, the British government didn't just seem distant, it seemed deaf. Every petition was ignored. Every protest was met with harsher laws. So the colonists didn't just write letters. They took to the streets. Across New England, a secretive, passionate group called the Sons of Liberty began organizing demonstrations. Founded in Boston by men like Samuel Adams, this group included craftsmen, merchants, and radicals who believed the colonies needed to fight back not just with words, but with action. They used boycotts as weapons. British imports sat unsold on shelves. American-made goods became a point of pride. Colonial women joined in too, forming the Daughters of Liberty, who spun homemade cloth so they wouldn't have to buy British textiles. But it wasn't all peaceful. When British tax collectors tried to do their jobs, they were often intimidated, threatened, or attacked. Effigies were hung from trees, buildings were vandalized, and violence simmered just under the surface. Tension grew with every passing day. On the 5th of March, 1770, that tension boiled over. In the snowy streets of Boston, a crowd of colonists gathered around a group of British soldiers. They shouted insults, threw snowballs, some with rocks inside. The soldiers, nervous and confused, loaded their weapons. Suddenly, shots rang out. 5 colonists were killed, including Crispus Attucks, a formerly enslaved black man often remembered as the first American to die in the cause of liberty. The incident shocked the colonies. Patriots like Paul Revere and Samuel Adams spread the news, and the outrage like wildfire. Revere even published a famous engraving of the scene, showing the British soldiers firing into a peaceful crowd. Though the soldiers were put on trial and some acquitted, thanks to a fair defense by John Adams, the event became known as the Boston Massacre. It was no longer just about taxes, it was about blood in the streets. In 1773, Parliament passed the Tea Act not to raise money, but to bail out the struggling British East India Company. The law gave the company a monopoly on tea sales in America, undercutting colonial merchants. To the British, it seemed like a simple solution. To the colonists, it was an attack on free trade, and one more sign that Parliament would make decisions without colonial consent. On the night of the 16th of December, 1773, a group of Boston citizens, some dressed as Mohawk Indians, boarded 3 British ships in Boston Harbor. They opened 342 chests of tea and dumped over 90,000 pounds of it into the sea. This was no minor act of vandalism. It was a bold, theatrical act of political defiance. And Britain's response would shake the colonies to their core. In retaliation, the British government passed a series of harsh laws the colonists called the Intolerable Acts. Boston Harbor was closed until the tea was paid for. The Massachusetts government was placed under British control. Town meetings were limited, and the Quartering Act allowed British soldiers to be housed in colonists' homes. It was meant to break Boston's spirit. Instead, it united the colonies. For the first time, people in New York, Virginia, and South Carolina, who had once seen Boston's rebellion as too extreme, now saw the danger of British overreach. If it could happen in Boston, it could happen anywhere. In 1774, in response to the Intolerable Acts, the colonies did something extraordinary. They joined together. 12 of the 13 colonies sent delegates to meet in Philadelphia. It was the first time they had acted as one body, one people. The meeting would be called the First Continental Congress, and it would change the course of history. The stage was now fully set. The protests were over. The revolution was coming. The year was 1774, and the American colonies were at a crossroads. For over a decade, they had protested, petitioned, and resisted British rule, but now the situation was spiraling. The Intolerable Acts had slammed Boston into silence. British troops patrolled the streets. The harbor was closed. The local government had been stripped of power. The message from London was clear: obey or suffer. But instead of cowering, the colonies rallied. For the first time in history, leaders from across the 13 colonies, from the icy ports of Massachusetts to the tobacco fields of Virginia, agreed to come together, not as separate colonies, but as one united front. On the 5th of September, 1774, delegates from 12 colonies, all except Georgia, arrived in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, a thriving city known for its tolerance, diversity, and innovation. They met in Carpenters Hall, a modest building that would soon echo with some of the most important debates in American history. These men were lawyers, merchants, planters, and philosophers. Some were fiery radicals, like Samuel Adams and Patrick Henry. Others, like John Dickinson of Pennsylvania, hoped for peace and reconciliation. But all of them came with a single mission: to respond together to British tyranny. This was the First Continental Congress, the first real step toward American nationhood. Debate, division, and resolve. The Congress didn't start with calls for independence. In fact, most delegates still hoped to restore their rights within the British Empire, not to break from it. For weeks, they debated. Should they call for a boycott of British goods? Should they prepare for armed resistance? Should they send one last petition to King George III? Despite their differences, one thing was clear. The colonies needed a unified voice. In the end, the Congress agreed to take several bold steps. The Continental Association, a massive colonial-wide boycott of British goods, to begin on the 1st of December, 1774. A Declaration of Rights and Grievances, a powerful document asserting that colonists were entitled to the same rights as Englishmen, including consent to taxation and self-government. A direct appeal to King George III, a respectful petition, asking him to stop Parliament's overreach and restore the harmony that once existed. But behind the scenes, a much more serious decision was forming. Prepare for war. Colonies were quietly urged to train local militias, collect gunpowder, and be ready for what was starting to feel inevitable. I am not a Virginian, but an American. One of the most powerful moments came from Patrick Henry of Virginia. Standing before the Congress, he made a bold declaration. I am not a Virginian, but an American. It was a radical idea. For generations, colonists had thought of themselves by their colony, a New Yorker, a Pennsylvanian, a South Carolinian. But now, for the first time, they were beginning to think of themselves as Americans. A new identity was forming, one born from shared struggle, shared sacrifice, and a shared dream of liberty. After nearly 2 months of deliberation, the Congress adjourned in late October. The delegates agreed to reconvene in May 1775 if things did not improve. But deep down, many feared that by then, it might be too late. Back in Boston, tensions were at a breaking point. British troops were watching every move. Colonial militias were quietly drilling. Powder was being hidden. Spies and informants whispered in taverns and churches. The fuse had been lit. The First Continental Congress wasn't just a meeting, it was the beginning of a revolutionary government. The colonies were no longer acting like subjects of the crown. They were behaving like a nation in the making. And soon, the world would hear their cry not through letters or laws, but through gunfire.